When you retire, basically what you're doing is giving up some or all of your income in exchange for some combination of guaranteed income from Social Security, a pension payout, perhaps an annuity payout, and distributions from your retirement savings. You're giving up income from your work and you're replacing it with some other form of income. One mistake that a lot of people make early on in their retirement is taking too much out of their retirement nest egg, out of their retirement savings in those first few years after retirement. And it could be for any number of reasons. It might be that you had some unforeseen expense come up, medical expense, maybe repairs on the house, something like that. Maybe there's a bad market and you retire right before some bear market where the value of your retirement savings goes down and you have to take out a larger portion than you were expecting to. The point here is that right after you retire is the most tenuous point in your entire retirement plan because you have the longest to live and the most at stake. It's mathematically the scariest point. And the mistake that some people run into here is simply because of unforeseen circumstances taking too much out of the accounts in those early years. Some people like to call this the retirement income death spiral, which sounds scary because it is. It can derail a lot of retirement plans. It might be a little hyperbole as well. Practitioners will sometimes call this concept sequence of returns risk. And so in this video, we're going to cover 3 ways that you can guard against sequence of returns risk, aka the retirement income death spiral, as well as mathematically, what is this thing? Why do we care about it? Why is it important? And as I mentioned, 3 things that you can do to guard against it and hopefully avoid it entirely. Okay, so to make this point, we're going to look at a hypothetical couple. Let's call them Frank and Joanna. And for Frank and Joanna, they're trying to build a financial and retirement plan that allows them to retire when they want and get what they want out of their assets and live a happy and fulfilling retirement. And so what we're looking at here is a simple projection. We've told this program that we use in our financial planning office everything about Frank and Joanna, including their assets, their liabilities, their spending every year, their income, their tax situation, their Social Security, their investments, everything financial about Frank and Joanna we've entered into our program here. And if we tell the program that Frank and Joanna are going to work until they're 65 respectively and live until age 100, this is a simple linear projection of their investment assets every single year. Right now, they might have about 1.2 million in retirement accounts. They're going to work and add to those accounts over the next few years. Those accounts hopefully are going to grow from investment growth on their own, and then they're going to stop working. They're going to shut off that income spigot and start taking money out of their accounts instead. And that's when these columns go down throughout their retirement. Now, as you can see, this is not a terribly great financial plan. It's not one that I would have a whole lot of confidence in at the outset, at least. But it's a helpful starting point. Now, one thing I should mention is that the height of these columns represents their total investment assets over time, assuming they get the long-term average rate of return on their investments. So what our program does here is it has this big fat database of historical market returns for all these different asset classes that Frank and Joanna might ever want to invest in. And then it looks at their portfolio, assigns each investment to an asset class, and then puts that together to assume a long-term average rate of return. So if Frank and Joanna, if the program expects them to earn 7% on average over their portfolio, in this model, we're assuming they get 7% on their investments every single year. And that is highly unrealistic. In fact, it's probably impossible because, as you know, markets go up, markets go down. One year you might have 10% returns. The next year you might have 15%. The next year the market might crash. You might lose 20%. That risk, that volatility is the price of admission for the long-term returns that we're all hoping for out of our investments. So this is a helpful starting point, but we don't want to trust it too much because it's very unrealistic. Now, that being said, what it does tell us is that Frank and Joanna need to make a few changes. So for them, if they're going to run out of money here in their 80s, well, what if they sold the vacation house? Maybe they get $275,000 for the vacation house. And by doing so, they reduce their property taxes and maintenance by $15,000 per year. Well, now we're buffering the system a little bit. It looks pretty good. The other obvious thing that they could do is retire a few years later and put more money into the retirement accounts over those 3 years, have their expenses covered by their income for a few more years, and shorten the length of their retirement by 3 years by doing so. And so now, at the outset, we're starting to look pretty good. Now, we don't want to rely too much on this model because, again, it assumes 7% returns every single year, or about 7%, I should say. So the next item that we want to address here is called a Monte Carlo simulation, where we instruct the program to run 1,000 different trials, knowing the long-term average rate of returns, the probabilities that each of those asset classes go up and down and sideways, and based on Frank and Joanna's portfolio, if we instruct the program to run 1,000 trials, knowing all those assumptions about Frank and Joanna, in how many of those 1,000 trials did they get to age 100 with money in the bank, and in how many of them did they work their assets down to zero? And here what we see is that in 840 of those trials, they got to age 100 with money in the bank, and in 160 of them did they work their assets down to zero. So this is a pretty strong plan at the outset. But as we're going to look at here in a moment, a lot can happen in the first few years of retirement, and we want to avoid that death spiral or that sequence of returns risk. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that sometimes practitioners like to call the retirement income death spiral sequence of returns risk. Realistically, those are actually two slightly different things. The death spiral, which I don't think I've ever heard a practitioner use those words, but you'll find it on the internet, has to do with the idea that in the early years of retirement, right after you've given up your income from work and you're relying on your nest egg to live off of for the rest of your life, you simply take too much out of the portfolio. Either because the portfolio shrinks because of poor investment returns in that year, or maybe some unforeseen expense like we were talking about. Any variety of things could cause this. Because in any prudent retirement plan, you're probably expecting some kind of investment returns on your savings over a 20 or 30-year retirement. But if you take too much out of the nest egg, out of the pile in the early years, there's no return that can recover from that. And that's what the death spiral is simply taking too much out in the early years. Now, sequence of returns risk is a little bit different. Let's say that we're planning for a 30-year retirement. 30 years is a long period of time, long enough to where you're going to enjoy all sorts of good markets and good economies. You'll have to suffer through probably a couple bear markets and market corrections and crashes and maybe a couple recessions in there. You'll have a wide variety of stuff going on financially. So if you take those 30 years of returns one by one, the return you get in each of those 30 years throughout a retirement, and you rank them in terms of worst return first, that's mathematically the worst thing that can happen to you. Because again, at the very beginning of your retirement, that's when you have the most at stake, you have the longest to live, the size of the pile might be at its highest. And if you experience the worst returns right after you give up your income, mathematically that's the hardest to recover from. So sequence of returns risk is, hey, over 30 years, we know we're going to have a wide variety of returns on a year-to-year basis. But if we just have unfortunate timing and run into a bear market and experience the very worst ones first, that's the hardest to recover from. So now let's take a look at what this means from a cash flow perspective. I'm going to fast forward a few years. Let's assume that Frank and Joanna decide that they're going to work for a few extra years in order to get to that 84% quote-unquote probability of success. Well, in 2033, when they're 66 and 65, based on that projection, this is how much they might have across their various accounts. And from a cash perspective, Frank might earn 376 based on what he's earning today plus inflation over the next few years. Joanna, if she's still working part-time, might be making around 63,000. And maybe they're filing for Social Security at that point too. Let's just assume that they are, for argument's sake. Joanna might have a hospital pension. Let's pencil that in too. And so in this year, they're making over $500,000 between the two of them. Now, their living expenses, let's assume they're close to $157,000 in this year. They have a few liabilities, not very many. They've paid off the house at this point. Maybe they have a couple car payments left, but pretty much everything's paid off. They'll have insurance premiums to pay. They'll owe a whole bunch of money in taxes on their income. And because they're still working, they're going to contribute as much as they can to their respective 401k plans at work. Now, beyond this money that they're putting into the 401k, they still have a bunch of extra cash because of their income. And we're going to assume that they take all that extra cash and they just spend it while they're still working. They're not doing any additional savings beyond this 33,000 or so that's left over. So this goes on in 2033, 2034, but then in 2035, this is the first year of their retirement. So their earnings go away. Remember, they're replacing their earnings, their income from work with guaranteed income sources. They already had Social Security turned on. Joanna gets her pension. They have guaranteed income of $92,354. But their expenses are higher than that. They have $158,000 that they need to spend for just day-to-day stuff. They still have their insurance premiums they need to pay for. And they'll owe some money in taxes, but not quite as much as they did before. So their net cash flow here is negative $85,000. That's their retirement income gap. That's the amount of money they need to take out of their retirement savings in order to make ends meet in this year. And one really common way to evaluate this is by what's called retirement distribution rate. So if we take the amount they need to pull out of their portfolio to exist, $85,077, and we divide it by their portfolio assets at the beginning of the year, that's our distribution rate. And when I do the math, I get very close to 2.8% for this year, 2035. Now we fast forward a year, they get a cost of living adjustment for their Social Security. Joanna gets a cost of living adjustment in her pension, but their living expenses go up too. So their net cash flow is very similar, a little bit more negative, but hopefully their portfolio grew that year as well. So their distribution rate here in these first few years is about 2.8%. So what's too much? Is that 2.8% that Frank and Joanna are taking out of their portfolio in the early years too low, too high? Is it adequate? Well, based on the initial Monte Carlo probability of success, things are looking pretty good. One rule of thumb that a lot of people like to use because it's based on pretty good data, I think it's pretty handy, but somewhat unrealistic, and I'll explain that in a moment, is the 4% distribution rule for retirement distributions. And what that means is there's been a lot of study around how much you can safely take out of your portfolio every year in retirement without running out of money. So the 4% rule says if you have $1 million of portfolio, you can take out $40,000 a year every single year plus inflation on that $40,000 every single year over a 30-year retirement without ever running out of money. And the genesis of this is there was a gentleman named Bill Bengen who was a financial planner in the mid-90s. He had a bunch of clients who were approaching retirement, and he was a good professional, and he wanted to make sure that they were not going to run out of money in retirement. So what he did is grabbed a bunch of data, a bunch of market return history, and assumed that all his clients, just hypothetically, were in a portfolio of 60% stocks, the S&P 500, and 40% bonds, 5-year US T-bills. And he assumed that if you retire in 1927 and you had a 30-year retirement, he went back, used that data, and determined how much he could take out of a portfolio every year over that time span of returns history and not run out of money. And then he slid the window forward by 1 year, 1928 for 30 years, which would have been through 1957, 1929 through 1958, so on and so forth. And he figured out what's the maximum withdrawal rate in each of those rolling 30-year periods. Now, if memory serves, I think he had 33 rolling 30-year periods in his initial paper, which was published in 1994. And in a lot of these periods, if you had good timing and good market returns early on, you could take out 6%, 7%, 10% every single year without ever running out of money. But even in the most unfortunate circumstances, where the market crashes right after you stop working, the one rate that worked every time was 4%. So the 4% rule comes from some pretty good data. And it's been revised and improved a lot over the years. And if you're interested, take a look at the Trinity study out of Trinity University. There are a number of researchers that have taken the ball and run with it from that concept of how much can I take out of my portfolio every single year without running out of money. Now, I will say it's a bit unrealistic because I've never met a single person who has a consistent spending need every year throughout their entire retirement. 4% is nice. It's clean, it's easy. If you have $1 million in your accounts, you can take $40,000 out plus inflation every single year and kind of not worry about it. Well, most people don't have spending needs that matches that consistent pattern. And in Frank and Joanna's case, they might spend less in one year and more in another year. So in the early years, they're taking out 2.8% per year. That's less than 4%, which means that they appear to be on pretty good footing. But let's look at what happens if they have that unfortunate timing, they have bad sequence of returns risk, and the value of their accounts falls dramatically right after they stop working. Now let's take a look at what might happen to Frank and Joanna if they run into bad timing and really hit that unfortunate sequence of returns risk where the markets crash right after they stop working, which again is mathematically the most tenuous point. Now, this could be similar to the situation where maybe one of them got hurt or needed surgery or they had some big unforeseen medical or other expense. The whole point is if you take more money than you really should out of your retirement savings in the early years of your retirement, it's kind of a dangerous game. So for Frank and Joanna here, let's say that they run into a bad market right after they stop working and the value of their investment portfolio falls by 30%. That's happened many, many times over the years and is not something that we can ever discount or take entirely off the table, even if you have a very diversified portfolio. So in Frank and Joanna's case, they're still better off than they were by working those extra years. But if the market crashes right after they stop working, they're getting a lot of it right back. Now, from a Monte Carlo perspective, if we run 1,000 trials using this scenario, now our probability of success goes down from 84% down to about a coin flip. Now, again, we can't put all our eggs in this basket because we're telling the program that all those assumptions are going to remain consistent over the rest of Frank and Joanna's lives. And if Frank and Joanna are like 99.9% of the people I've ever met in my whole life, if you stop working where you're relying on your retirement savings to live on for the rest of your life, and then the value of that nest egg falls by 30% because of unfortunate timing, you're probably not going to do the exact same stuff you would have otherwise. You're going to tighten the belt. Maybe you travel a little bit less. I'm guessing Frank and Joanna would probably make some other changes to their financial and retirement plan. But obviously, if the value of the pile falls by quite a bit, so will their chances at a good outcome. Now, from a cash flow and a distribution perspective, the first year of retirement, in Frank and Joanna's situation, they have a lot of cash they can draw from. They have a hefty cash balance, but they're getting Social Security. They're getting Joanna's pension. They have money coming in. Then they have their living expenses. They have insurance premiums to pay, and they have a lot of money going out. So they have a need to draw about $80,000 from their pile in some way, shape, or form. Now, we're going to assume in Frank and Joanna's case that they have a nice emergency fund in cash that they can use to pay for expenses while hopefully the market sorts itself out. Sometimes that's a good idea. Sometimes it's not a good idea. We're going to assume that they're pulling from cash rather than taking money out of their portfolio in the year that the market crashes. And so if I run the numbers on this, their net cash flow is actually lower because they're paying less in tax, but their portfolio assets are a lot lower as well. And when we do the math on this, their distribution rate has gone up from where it was previously, from 2.8 to closer to 3.5% here. And if you fast forward a few years, even after a couple of years of recovery, they have a net cash flow of negative $85,000. Their portfolio balance has recovered a little bit, but not a whole lot yet. And their distribution rate now is up to 4.2%. So in Frank and Joanna's case, they've exceeded that 4% threshold that we talked about. That might be okay, it might not. But in any event, their distribution rate is going to change pretty dramatically, and that might be kind of tenuous for their long-term retirement plan. So the key here is that your distribution rate in your retirement plan is not going to be consistent. It's going to be lower, higher. A lot of people talk about the go-go years of retirement right after you stop working, where you have time on your hands and energy to do stuff. And then the slow-go years, as you start to get older and slow down, maybe you're not traveling quite as much, but you're still enjoying yourself. And then later on in life, the no-go years, where you're spending dramatically less because you simply don't have the energy to do the stuff that you used to enjoy. That's one example, but I've never met anybody who has a consistent spending pattern over a 30-year retirement. It simply doesn't happen. Now, to guard against the sequence of returns risk, or however you like to call it, the retirement death spiral or anything in between, there are 3 things that we can build into our retirement plans that are really, really helpful. One of them is pretty basic, pretty easy, but it's just to engineer your retirement plan to reduce your distribution rates in those first few tenuous years. And that could be from a combination of things. Maybe it's deciding to take your pension a little bit earlier than you otherwise would, or Social Security is an example of that. You may want to wait until 70 to maximize your benefit, but hey, if you take it a little bit earlier, you're reducing the stress on your retirement portfolio and your investment assets. Another example is maybe you find a part-time job or taper your work instead of going from full-time working to full-time retired. If you have a little bit of part-time income coming in, that offsets the amount that you need to take out of your accounts, and that reduces the pressure on your portfolio as well. Number 2 is build some flexibility into your plan. And there's been some interesting research here in the last, I want to say 15, 20 years around retirement planning using what are called guardrails, where when you have good market returns, you have good sequence of returns in your retirement in those early years, what you do is loosen the belt and spend a little bit more. But you build flexibility into your spending and retirement plan so that you know that when the markets are not so good, that you haircut your spending, you tighten the belt, and simply take less out of the portfolio in those circumstances. And if you can build that kind of flexibility into your retirement plan, you can flex when times are good and flex when times are bad, and that really, really improves your chances. And there has been a lot of good research surrounding that concept. So number 1 is we want to try to reduce distribution rates in the early years when we can. Number 2 is if you can find some way to build flexibility into your retirement plan by having more of your expenses be maybe discretionary than fixed, that goes to help your case too. Now, the third concept here is when you're thinking about investing your retirement portfolio, there's a lot of different ways to think about asset allocation and how much of your portfolio goes into various types of investments. And the most basic way to do it, which is really effective, is 60% of your assets in stocks, 40% of your assets in bonds. Well, from a distribution standpoint, one way to manage sequence of returns risk is try to coordinate that to where you have at least 3 or 4 years of living expenses in your bond portfolio. Because what happens is if you run into bad timing and you have bad sequence of returns, you can simply not touch your stocks when they're down in value temporarily. When the markets crash, stocks tend to fall by more than bonds do, right? It doesn't happen like that every single time, no matter what, but generally that's what happens. And if you have 3 or 4 years of your expenses in bonds, those are the assets that you can liquidate and sell and take out of your accounts to simply allow your stocks more time to recover. Because the worst bear markets that we've had in history don't last any longer than 3 or 4 years. And in general, what we're trying to do to achieve good long-term returns is buy low and sell high, and give your equities more time to grow and do their thing so that you can capture good long-term market returns. So that's it for today's video. I hope you found it helpful. Just remember those 3 things that we talked about. If you can, try to take a little bit less out of your portfolio in those early years. Build some flexibility into your retirement plan through a guardrails approach or something similar. And number 3, if you can build 3 or 4 years of expenses into your bond portfolio, you're just giving yourself more time to recover from a potentially bad market that we really can't control. Now, don't forget, like this video and subscribe to our channel to make sure that you're notified anytime we publish something new.